Okay, so again, we're looking at crashing, and in this case, we're going to look at just a couple of different examples. And as it says here, and as I've underlined here, crashing a project, and it usually involves considerable cost. So what we're going to look for here then is, what do we do when cost is no object, which is one sort of case scenario, and what do we do if you have a budget? Okay, and it's going to involve two separate types of thinking you need to look of it. But let's look at the different steps. So if there's no object, you identify every possible path, calculate its length. How much can each path be reduced, and what would the cost be? Perform all necessary reductions necessary to create a new critical path. Perform other reductions to reduce other paths to the length of the critical. So basically, you want to make sure that you're you're using up you're cutting back as much as you can where you can. Okay, and we'll come back to the budget one in a moment. All right, because it does get a little bit more complicated. So here's a question. It says construct a network diagram, and here's your costs that are involved. Okay, so this is for this type of so C is an example of when I've got no budget. Okay, and what I've done is got the completed network diagram. I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking you. You're going to have to be able to do it. I'm not going to show it here because that just takes more time, and I want to sort of cut that down to as much as possible for this instance. So let's have a look at this. So let's the possible reduction. So I could take off 2 there, so I get 5 days. I could take off here. I've got so that was for C. I can take it. Possible reduction is 2 days, so I can go to 3. Okay, what else? B, I can cut back by 2, so that's 3 there. B, D, D, was it B? What am I up to? D, I can cut back 1, so that becomes 2. E, I can cut back 3, so that becomes 2. F, I can cut back 3, so that becomes 4. And G and I can't touch. H, I can. So H, I'm going to cut back 1, so that becomes 3. Now, things you need to look for here. So if I did all my reductions, so what I've got in this column here are, I've highlighted a couple of things. So the blue is your critical path, your green is a second path, and the yellow is another path. I'm going to call them paths 1, 2, and 3, as I've shown here. And as you can see, path 1 has 14, path 18 has path 2 has 18, path 3 is 19. So after I crash them, so let's just count them up as I go. So I'm going to go 5, 3, and 2. So that's going to be 5 and 3 is going to be 8, and 2, so it's going to be 10. Okay. If I go to green one, I'm going to go 3, 4, so 7, 10, 12. And then for the blue, I'm going to go 3, 5, 7, 10, 12. Okay, so my new critical paths are basically these ones here. Now, at the same time, this is down to 10. So basically, 2 of those weeks, I don't actually have to worry about because I'm not saving any money potentially. All right, but I do want to stay at 12. So when I say 2 extra because I'm going from 14 to 10, but new ones are at 12. So I don't want to put all of them back on, but I look at my costs. So in this case, I look at A and C here. Okay, so A is 300, cost 302 days. C was 0 cost and 2 days. So what I can do is I can say I'd get rid of this one. I'd get rid of the A. I wouldn't now have it been crashed in that sense, and I'll just take the time off C. So that's not going to add any additional cost. Remember, you want it the minimal. Even though it's no budget, you want to keep it to a minimum where you can. So that basically means that, I can change this one now to 12, because I've taken the 2 off the C and I've got left with 3 there, but it's kept the same there. Now, here's what we've got to do for the next lot. We've got to have a look and go B, so we can do a cost. let's just do a cost here. We're going to say B is 2 days, okay? And it's 400 per day, so that's 800. D, so I've done that. So let's go to D. D is, so D is 1 day. D is 1 day, and that's 400. E is 3, so let's go, E is how many days? 3 days, and that's going to be 300 each day. So that is now 900. Okay, F, I'm going 3 days, 200 a pop, so that's 600. And then I've got H at 1 day, and then that's at 400. And if you count that up, that's, I sort of go 1,000 here, 1,200 here, so that's 2,200 plus 900. So my answer is it's going to cost me $3,100 when I've got no set budget. Okay, no specific, I've got to keep it to a certain cost. And I've brought it down as much as I can. So I've gone from a 19, I can't remember what this one was, 19-day plan to a 12-day plan now. But it's going to cost me just over $3,000. Okay, so that's how you can look at doing that sort of question there. Now, if you look at the other type of question, which was D here, which is where you got a $2,000 budget. How do I manage that? And here's the sort of, you identified a possible pass. Look at the critical path, see if you can reduce them. If you can't do much else. And then if you have enough money reducing activity on a critical path, choose the most efficient one. So if you got only 2 days to, you sort of got to look at the money of it. You know, where's the money come in? And what gain you get from it. That's what step 3 is basically doing. You might identify new critical paths and then see if you can reduce other parts to match that critical path with staying within your budget. Okay, so that's this thing again. Okay, so in this one, it's a bit of a finer process. Okay, so I'm actually going to refer to the notes here just so you can see it, so it makes it really clear because it's easy one to sort of mix up here. Okay, keep the same path idea, so path 1, 2, and 3 as before. Okay, so as we've got, and so here I'm looking, that's the notes we've got there. So we can give an original critical path, we can make reductions in B, D, E, and H. Okay, so let's start by doing that. And the first ones we really want to start are not D and E. We'll come back to them if we need B, but we'll come back to those. But we'll first look at B and H, because B and H will impact on both paths 2 and 3. So let's do those first. So I can reduce B by 2 days, costing $800. Okay, so remember it was B was 400 per day. Okay, so I can go B for 2 days at $800. All right, so that's dropping that down to 3. I'm dropping that down to H, remember, can go 1 day. So I'm going to drop that down to 3 days there. And then I can go, so H is 1 day. That's going to cost me 400. So far, if we're going to make a balance, we've got 1,200 left. All right. So this is where I start to have to look at this section here. Do I reduce F, D, or E? So let's have a look at the cost of F. It would be potentially $200 per day. D would be a $400 per day, probably not the best option. And E would be 300. So, and note with F, I've got a bit of play there. So F and E, I've got a bit of play. D, I've got only $400 for 1 day. Probably not going to be my best bet. All right. So reducing, and this is what they said here, reducing E is cheaper than reducing D, okay? Because at this point, let's actually count this. So I've gone from 19. So now remember I had 14 for 1, 2, and 3. This was 18. This was 19. 1 is still 14. 2 is going to be 3, 10, 13, 15. 3 at this point is going to be, so past 3, so 3, 6, 6 and 8, 6 and 8, 6 and 5 is 11, 14, 16, okay? So past 3, I've still got to reduce down a little bit. And I can reduce that, so that's at 16 days, okay, for path 3. So what I've got to look at here is, so basically means if I go reduce E by 1 day, that's 300. So that means I've now got 1,500 less. So I'm dropping that down to 4. And that means if I'm going to go 1, 2, and 3 again, this is my paths, 14, 15, 15. So I've now got, so back at this step here, remember, this was essentially, no, it wasn't anything. Now I've got these 2 critical paths, okay? But now I've still got $500 to spend, all right? If we look back here, 500, so if I've got F and E, F is 200 and E is 300. I can get 200 from the F, 200 from the E. That gives me my $2,000, and I can take a day off, another day off. So I'm going to take a day off here, make that 3. Take a day off here, make that 6. Okay, so that means now I've got E as another day. Oops, I'm not going to put an equal there. That's now 1,200, and I'm going to go F. Sorry, I should actually write that with my thing. So I'm going to go 300. F is 1 day, is that should be 500 there. Is 200. So therefore, I've got $0. Sorry, 0. That should be. Oh, sorry, it is 1,500. I was thinking the wrong way around. Plus 500, so that gives me $2,000. Okay. So now that means my final part here would be, that's still 14, that's 14, and that's now 14. So all of them are now critical paths. All these are now critical paths, and I've spent $2,000, and I've dropped this time from 19 to 14 days. So I've been able to crash the project by 5 days by spending $2,000 and being careful how and when I use it. Okay, all right. There's another 2 examples that you can work through. Thanks. Bye.